We are going to spend the next 15 to 20 minutes to talk about our experience of integrating the Chinese user community into Apache Flink. My name is Robert. I'm a PMC member and committer at the Apache Flink project for many years, since the incubation. And with me is Fabian Hueske. He's also a committer and PMC member, was also involved in the incubation. We are working for a company called Viverica, which is offering products and services around Apache Flink, and is owned by Alibaba, one of the largest e-commerce and technology companies on this planet. And before I start talking about specifics of our integration, I would like to tell you a little bit about China. And I have visited China for the first time a few weeks ago, and I also went to Shanghai. And this picture is actually Shanghai. It looks quite different from what you might think how Shanghai looks, because this picture is from 30 years ago. This is Shanghai Pudong. It was just some fishing boats and some small shops, or like small workshops. Today, this is how Shanghai Pudong looks. It has one of the second largest building in the world, and it's the financial center of China. If you look on Wikipedia about the economic development of China, you'll find that it's the second largest economy in the world. It has managed to reduce extreme poverty for 800 million people. Its middle class has 400 million people, which have an income around 10 to 50,000 US dollars a year. And there are 400 billionaires in China, growing by 2 each week. Also, looking at one of the global problems, China has 40% of the global installed solar capacity. Looking closer to technology, 38% of all global venture capital investments are done in China, and China has most of the unicorn companies in the world. Unicorn company is a company with more than $1 billion of valuation. Only last year, they added almost 100 new unicorns to their startup ecosystem. And obviously, the startup ecosystem and also the existing technology companies in China like Tencent, Baidu, Alibaba, they all contribute to a very big open source community. It's the second most active country on GitHub by the number of user accounts since 2015. There are also some Apache projects which originated in China from Chinese companies or Chinese communities, such as Apache Dabo, Skywalking, RocketMQ, or Kylin. And also, if you want to have some like anecdotal evidence about the size of the Chinese open source community, if you look at the trending projects on GitHub, you will find that more than every second project is actually Chinese. So that you can see that the description is in Chinese or it's from Chinese companies, and this should give you an impression of the dominance that this country has in the open source space. And if you go to the GitHub page of one of these projects, you'll also find that it's very difficult for us from the Western world to understand what this project is about. So it's pretty apparent that there's a clear separation of communities just by the language barriers. Zooming in further to Apache Flink, if we look at the number of website visitors, we can see that the biggest country where people are coming from to the Flink website is China. Also, I've added like a long-term view of the number of users on our website. And you can actually see that the number of users is dropping at certain events, and you can correlate them also to the Western Christmas, but you can also correlate them to Chinese New Year, to Labor Day in China. There was also Labor Day in Germany at that day. But for example, here at the end, at the right, the National Day is a 1-week celebration this year where China basically closed down and celebrated 70 years of China. And this has a pretty visible impact on our website traffic for the Flink project. So we noticed these numbers, and we started looking around, and we saw that there is huge meetup events happening in China with more than 500 participants going to Flink meetups, and more than 1,000 people attending Flink Forward Beijing last year. There will be another Flink Forward this year, which will have even more people attending. And if you look even closer, you will find that there's quite a lot of things happening in China relating to Flink. So there is a website, there used to be a website called flink-china.org, which was basically a full translation of the Flink website and a partial translation of the Flink documentation. Another evidence of the size of the Chinese Flink community are 2 Ding Talk groups. So Ding is something like Slack in the Western world, which has 13,000 members talking about Flink. It's mostly like a user support mailing list, and being in that channel is like a waterfall of text messages and smileys coming at you. So what we had to realize by the end of last year is that 2 separate communities have developed. And there are several reasons for this development. Probably the biggest is the language barrier. It is similarly hard for people in China to learn our language, English or another Western language, as it is hard for us to learn Chinese. So I think we have to really appreciate that those who participate and speak English have put a big investment into learning English. Then there's different tools and services. In China, people are not used to using mailing lists. They grew up with apps such as Ding Talk, QQ, WeChat. There's no Stack Overflow. They don't use meetup.com. And partially this is caused by access barriers such as the firewall, but obviously it's also caused by the language. And we were really not aware of how big the Flink community was. And even to that date, we are not entirely sure what is happening. But we also saw a huge opportunity. The opportunity to connect 2 of the largest economies in the world to work together on one open source project, to get all the people that are really motivated, really smart, to work on Flink, to have one global community, not to have 2 different projects, 2 different documentations, 2 different user support groups. Like, everything should be together. Then we have twice the power, twice the size, and we can really make Flink a bigger and more successful project. And Fabian is now going to talk about some things we did to integrate the community.
Yes, so in the beginning of this year, we started actively efforts to actively invite members of the Chinese community to join us on the in the Apache Flink community, and obviously this also involves teaching these people the Apache way, basically bring the ideas of the Apache Software Foundation to these people in China. And so we started with these efforts about 10 months ago. And something that we did first was reaching out to the maintainers of the flink-china.org website. And if you look a little bit into Apache policies and trademark issues, you notice that it's not okay to have such a website. So we reached out to the people and told them, hey, we invited them, hey, this is a great effort. I mean, you're translating our content. This is really a huge investment and effort. And we asked them, hey, would you be willing to donate this content to the Apache Flink project? And we started, they agreed, and we started to set up a translated version of the Apache Flink website. So this website is now, or the content of the translated version of the website is now available under Flink Apache org/ZH. So this folder basically holds all the translated content. And we started a big effort in Flink. We call these Flink integration proposal. And also define processes how we can ensure that the content is kept in sync when we change something on the English version of the website. Basically, opening a Jira issue with a specific label, Chinese translation, that people then could pick up and forward the changes into the Chinese version as well. So today, the Chinese version of the website looks a bit like this. So you see that it's most of the content is translated. And it's basically just a simple, there's a simple switching between English and Chinese. We also reached out to these people and said, hey, if you know some Chinese companies that are using Flink and that would like to be listed on the Flink Powered By website, reach out to them, ask them if they're okay with that. We also got a few positive responses there. And today we have a couple of Chinese companies on our Powered By website. Yeah, the website is pretty much translated. For the documentation is, of course, a little bit of a bigger piece of content. A lot of things have already been translated, but there's still some work going on to basically close the gaps there. We also started, another thing that we did was starting a Chinese-speaking user mailing list. This is available on the user-zh@flinkapache.org. And we had already a few Chinese-speaking PMC members and committers, and we said, hey, we made these people obviously moderators. It's helpful if you speak the language that is used on the mailing list. So we made these community members moderators for the mailing list, and also asked them, hey, please keep an eye on there and try to help people coming up with questions. And if you look at how the mailing list evolved, you see that it's actually gaining in popularity, and more people are signing up and actually using also the mailing list in addition to all these groups on Ding Talk and QQ that Robert already mentioned. So we actually can attracted a few people actually to join the mailing list and ask their questions there, and also many people helping all these users with their questions. So a few lessons learned. So the translation effort was very well received. We got many people who helped with that, and some of our committers were very dedicated and then put a lot of effort in actually making this work. It's a good way to learn the contribution and collaboration process in an open source project, because it's a fairly easy way to get into an open source project. Helping with translations has a pretty low bar of getting into a project. And once you're in there, once you see, hey, what I do is helping the community, is helpful, many people decide to contribute more, sometimes also going into contributing source code and features, or contributing in other ways, like help organizing events. And eventually you also see that this website is also growing in traffic. Here, what the graph here shows is just the page views for translated pages. So everything under the ZH folder, so to say. You see, we kind of like started in February with the website. It picked up quickly and then slowly built up. The big drop at the end is again the Chinese national holiday. And of course, this only being Chinese pages had a pretty big impact. Yeah, so that's lessons learned number one. More lessons learned. What we found fairly important is to really meet members of this community in person, getting directly in touch with them, meeting them at conferences like Flink Forward China, inviting them here to the Flink conference that we did a couple of weeks ago here in Berlin or in San Francisco, meeting all these people in person and talking with them about Apache, but also about any other things, really helps to connect with these people and understand their mindset, and also, of course, them understanding us. So this is really crucial for to build up personal relationships, because if you have these relationships, it's much easier to really interact and solve issues. You should also, when you reach out to the to China and are able to attract or build up some momentum over there, you should also prepare for quite a bit of community growth. You see that the number of contributors in Flink is still growing quite quickly. On the right-hand side, the graph shows the activity of our dev mailing list. So there's lots of discussions happening on Flink's mailing list. Also, due to all the new members and contributors that are coming from China. It's also important to keep an eye or try to keep an eye on the community that is organizing themselves out of the Apache Software Foundation or ASF infrastructure, like everything that's not happening on the mailing list or not happening on GitHub, because there's lots of things happening. Robert already said there's these Ding Talk groups with thousands of people. There is large meetups that we don't really notice. And in this case, it really helps to have a personal relationship to somebody and ask, hey, are you aware of something that is going on there? And then try to invite these people also to become part of the Apache community. Integration of contributors has worked very well. Many of these of our Chinese friends also joined discussions about community and development processes. So we had a couple of discussions in the Flink community how to improve certain kinds of processes. Also had lots of discussions about bylaws for the Flink project, and this worked very well. It's a different thing for Flink users, because usually the language barrier is more significant talking to pure users of a framework than to collaborators or people who contribute, because these people usually speak English. When you're working with people from China in an open source project, you should also be aware that they use different names and nicknames across different services. So there is emails on the mailing list, on Jira, usernames in Jira and GitHub, and this, like, for us, they look completely different, but it might be the same person actually. So that's not always really easy to map people to all the nicknames. That part of the reason is they have their original Chinese name, they have a Chinese nickname, they have a westernized name that translate their names into Western characters, so all of that can be a bit difficult to map. But once you know, like, who's who, things become much easier. And finally, you should also not be too scared about emojis. Talking about future work, I already said we have lots of contributors coming from China. We also try to grow the number of committers and PMC members. From this pool of people. This also, of course, helps to have more people that are familiar with the community over there, and then helps to basically close the bridge between those communities. Pushing mailing list adoption further in Apache, something that didn't happen on the mailing list didn't happen. So of course, for development processes or for the development of the project, everything needs to be synced and also recorded. So this is a principle that we are of course following. We are trying to support event organizers, being in a way that they are comply with Apache trademarks and follow kind of like the roots of the Apache Software Foundation. But we also trying to learn best practices from our friends in China, how they were able to build a large community in China, and try and see how can we leverage this knowledge and also use it to grow the Flink community over there as well. And from our point of view, it's also important not to really force them to use our tools. Often it's also a matter of like integrating and seeing how can we make best use of their tools and practices. Yes, and I think the last point is something that's very, very hard, and I guess I'm not sure if anybody has a good idea how to do that, but it would also be nice to be able to figure out how can we actually enable non-English speakers to actively participate and contribute to the community. Yeah, with that we're done. Happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. I'm wondering what the foundation could do to help projects such as Flink, where you have this dual community. Would be useful to, I don't know, have someone on the ground in China who can help with the events, or have people help with translating, or what's your view?
I think something that is certainly helpful is to get people from this culture into the Apache Software Foundation. I think eventually this will happen. People who are contributing to Apache Flink contribute to other projects as well. I mean, Flink is not the only project. Robert already said there's also Kylan. Once these projects, there's people becoming members and becoming more familiar with the Apache Software Foundation, and maybe also taking up more responsibilities. So just being aware of the difference of the mindset of this culture will be certainly helpful. I think infrastructure-wise,
it's actually
some best practices, or like working on on a guideline or best practices, collecting the knowledge of the individual projects, like Kyling, like Flink, and all these projects that have this issue of bridging different or having part of a community in China and part in the Western world, and then an effort to collect this information and provide best practices there might be very helpful.
It's actually quite cool that the foundation has its own infrastructure, because at some point people were like, maybe we should move to GitHub, or maybe we should stop using all these old school mailing lists. But actually it is an advantage, because this stuff usually doesn't get blocked by the firewall. And also email usually works. So that is a big benefit. And for another aspect, Fabian basically said it, I think patience and being welcoming is what the foundation can do.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the very inspiring talks. And coming from a background of native Chinese speaker, I can totally echo on how hard it is to drag people from the chat environment that people are already used to, especially like WeChat and DingTalk that I work to. Also, I run communities myself, and one of the efforts we made is trying to make sure that everyone has access to information, and so that when they make decisions in consensus, they are informed. So we have been pushed forward for trying to make our communications transparent. Which I'm a new Apache community member, but I learn a lot here. One thing that I have seen, like for example, I also contribute a lot to Wikipedia. One thing that I've seen in that community is they have developed a kind of neutral way, decentralized way of forming their conversation. They rely on IRCs. They rely on Like they have used, some of them use Telegrams and Discords, and that has its own problems as well. But in that sense, they have certain vendor-neutral sense of what communication happens, and in return, what we learned from Wikimedia Foundation efforts is they have archives that actually trying to archive things from the other channels, so that when people need to make informed decisions, it doesn't necessarily have to be on that channel, but it can be archived and be searchable to whoever wants to be participating in the discussion. Maybe that's something to echo like what the Apache Software Foundation may be able to do. Another thing I personally, as a user, I have trying to communicate with people who speak language that I cannot speak. And on Facebook, there is an interesting feature that, like, whenever there is a discussion in the language I cannot speak, it will show a translation button, and then I can click and I can get into the discussion. Maybe this something can be done on the archive of Apache mailing list, so people who speak non-English could start to get more and more involved in this community.
There's actually quite a lot of people in our community translating a lot of stuff, like also community things, community updates. There's like a Chinese community update every week that summarizes what is happening in the Flink community on the dev mailing list. So it's quite nice that also from this side there are people really motivated.
Yeah, so actually we are kind of running late, so any more questions can be taken outside. Okay, if it's a question. Sorry.
So one short final question, and then we take the rest of the questions offline.
Offline is okay. Offline is okay? Yeah, so.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you.